Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's NWC webinar. We're covering today electronic production and composition fundamentals. And in this webinar today, we're basically going to be, well, it's not as much of a technical overview. We're going to be going over the fundamentals to actually approaching electronic music and producing in the box in such a way that's going to give you the mindset that helps you understand what goes into the musical process of putting something together, considering things like arrangement, sample choice, sounds, things like that. This webinar and more are available at nwcwebinars.com. A recording of this will be available afterwards later in the week. I'm Andrew Leyenhorst, Assistant Editor of Professional Sound, Consulting Editor for Canadian Musician, and I'll be joined by Dennis White, better known as LATROIT, a Grammy Award-winning producer, composer, and artist with a bunch of certified gold, platinum, double platinum selling records. And Dennis, you with me?
I think so.
Yep, I got you.
All right.
Dennis, thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Andrew. Nice to see you.
Yeah, nice to see you as well. So, again, we're just going to get right into it in terms of having a look at something. So we're going to look at a song here. And just start pulling this up. And make sure this is all going the way it needs to be. So, first things first. So, don't be too scared. This is what kind of a fuller, more finished session of mine looks like. And so, I guess, to you, Dennis, what sort of, when it comes to electronic music, really, what do you think is kind of the most important thing about creating the soul of it and the foundation that you like to work off of?
I don't think that I have one answer for that. It sort of depends on the project or how the idea came to me, or is it a remix? Is it an original composition? And where do I expect this to, where does it have to perform?
Okay.
So, and again, even if it's like a traditional club remix banger, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to start with drums for me. Many times I'll just throw a click track or the lowest common denominator loop together because the chordal movement or the bass line or some melodic component of it, I think, is either more important or at least the genesis for what I'm doing.
Okay.
Yeah,
and that makes sense. And in a way, with the song that we've got here, I think that actually sort of works to that example because, while the drums are the foundation, I think it's really the bass that's actually the driving factor here. So let me play the song. So we've got a nice little extended intro here. And then we get into the melodic elements. And so I think to go along with what you're saying, Dennis, this is driven more by, when I started this too, it was driven by the bass, not the drums. Okay,
so let's talk us through that a little bit. So I'm new to this. This is a recording that you did. When did you do this?
This is actually, I made this track at the beginning of the lockdown last year.
Okay.
Yeah, it's I haven't really, as far as my own stuff, haven't made much since. But I know this is one that I had, and I think it works well.
Okay, so talk us through the creative process of this. Did you record the bass? What did you start with on this track?
In this case, I knew I wanted a big kind of a very big, punchy, sort of distorted yet clean bass tone. So again, a kind of a Moog tone. I did this in particular. This is with Anna 2, which is a synth that's included with Stephen Slate's All Access Pass, which is kind of what I got that from. And so I think that's a thing that we could start by talking about as well, is the idea of sound selection. Let me duplicate this. And so this is where I began. Right, I knew I just wanted something very subtle in terms of, it's not busy. It carries its own weight and kind of is a little bit entrancing. All right, so the bass starts with this. Very simple. It's one note, just two little taps. And then from there, so if we add the drums in now, we've got, and then let me group these actually. And then we've just got the straight 4 on the floor. So that establishes the feeling, and then from there, the next step that I took was to actually add some delay behind it to kind of carry the groove. So now it's got that space and that feeling to it that wasn't quite there before. And so I knew that I wanted to start with the bass. That was the most important thing here. And then the drums were built in such a way as to support the bass. And actually, to mention what you mentioned earlier about tempo as well, I guess let me move this a little bit so I can see it. What are some tempos that you like? Do you typically kind of have a specific group or, you know, selection that you kind of like to start with?
No, it sort of really depends on the track and how I imagine the feel to be. I'll play around with the tempo of a song until the very last bounce. There was Dance My Tears Away, the song that I did in the beginning of the year, went through, I swear to God, it went through 5 different tempos ranging from 95 up to 120 back down to 105. I can't even remember where I landed tempo wise with that.
Oh,
for me, I know it's kind of weird, but the tempo of a song is really it's really important. It really, especially if there are vocals on it, the tempo of a song is going to determine how natural the delivery of the vocals or a melodic line is.
Yeah, and that's a good point too, because for example, if this technically, what's interesting and a little trick that I like to use for stuff that's like more down tempo, I guess it doesn't work as much in the mid tempo ranges, kind of in that 95 or like 90 to 120 range, just because that sits where it is. The tempo of this song is actually 77. But I have the click doubled to 154 so that the timing is actually subdivided by the metronome. And my click is really quiet. But instead of actually in Logic, for example, having it count 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, it's a lot easier to place samples and whatnot. For example, I find when you basically just double the entire grid, so then the actual count is 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, rather than leaving all of that space in there. So I find that for kind of more down-tempo stuff, you're actually going to have an easier time by doubling your tempo and then basically having each full beat represented by an eighth. But that's just something that I wanted to mention as well, because tempo is very much going to kind of set the tone for everything in your song. Because if I did this at something faster, it'd sound really silly if I'm going, unless that's what the song calls for.
Yeah. Good point.
Yeah. So we'll move along to the next part here, and we'll start to investigate the drums. Because what's interesting with drums is that usually what you're hearing is not typically, this counts for almost all forms of music, but I guess we'll start by looking at some drum layers here. And I guess compared to something of yours, for example, would you say that this is pretty sparse, or do you typically kind of still like to keep it nice and simple in terms of layering your drums?
What you're doing is familiar to me. Yeah, we do a bit of layering here all the percussion sounds. Yeah.
Okay, cool. So to break that down a little bit, the reason why you kind of want to think about blending samples, and again, that's a whole other thing. If you look over to the right side of the screen here, for example, I've just got this one particular library up, and that's a big part of it too, is starting right from your sounds. So in this case, the kick that I liked was one of them, sounded like this. All right, I'll solo all that. So it's very punchy, but it's very deep. There's a little bit of attack to it, but at the same time, it's mostly just thick and kind of gushy. And then it's dry and it's fat. The name of the sample is very apt. And then we'll look at the next one, which it's a very similar flavor, but I find that it has a little bit more of a kind of a woodiness to it. And then, so then you put those together, and I find that it makes a really nice full sound. They complement each other very well. And now we've got a new kick sound. Right, that's a little bit more unique than what we had before. And then to go on top of that, because it's a very simple groove, so we'll look at the snares now. So we've got this one, very kind of classic.
Oh, that's where the reverb is coming from. It's a sample.
It's right on the sample, yeah. And so that's something to keep in mind as well. So actually, Kimberly, that's a pretty good question. That just bring it up. Typically, in this case, like, it depends on where you get it from. For example, my samples in this case are mostly from libraries that I've purchased. In which case, by purchasing them, you can just kind of use them, especially because that's sort of what they're for. Very popularly as well, there are subscription services like Splice, for example, where you can subscribe there, and from there you can get samples and loops and things like that you can use. It really depends on where you're getting them from. And Dennis, if you want to weigh in on that, actually, as far as the legality of samples and all of that. There are some cases where if you're actually taking something from another song, you might need to have that cleared. But in terms of little things like drum sounds and whatnot, it's very much just depends on where it comes from.
Well, right. So you want to make sure that your samples are coming from someplace that have a blanket clearance license, that they're royalty-free samples that are approved for all uses. Splice.com offers that. Most sample places offer that, and they do a pretty good job of verifying that the samples that are on there are cleared. Yeah,
cool.
But I'll tell you another thing that's happening though, just real quick, since somebody asked. Kimberly asked, it said it's such a big issue for releasing music, especially if you want to license your music for ads, TV, and film. And you're right, Kimberly, it is a huge issue when it comes to that. And something that's been happening lately is that music production houses are disallowing the use of some samples from sample packs because there was an issue that arose one time that a hip hop track was in a commercial, and it had a piano line, and the piano line was a phrase from a sample pack. Anybody could use it. And then there was another hip hop artist with the same sample in the same song, but because those were different copyrights, that triggered a copyright issue. And it's one thing for the sample libraries to say, yeah, this is clearance free, this is royalty free, you do whatever you want with it. And another thing that happens once those get embedded into other songs and copyrights. So best to do as much of your own work as you can.
Yes, yeah, I'd agree with that. To get into this next little question here while we're still on it, these are not MIDI samples. There's not really such a thing as a MIDI sample, actually, because MIDI is ultimately a control protocol. And so even if you're thinking about like MIDI drums, for example, In that regard, the MIDI is simply telling a virtual instrument what to play, what audio file to trigger ultimately. So this is a very raw way of doing it, of laying samples in, where I'm literally taking audio, you know, going through, picking out something that I like, and then dragging it right onto the grid and building my tracks up that way. That's personally how I like to do it in this regard. I find it gives me a nice amount of control and all of that type of thing. But anyway, to kind of keep going with it, we'll get into the snares. And again, keep in mind as well, some samples will have little reverb tails or anything like, you know, something like that on it. In this case as well, I've actually also taken the snare, like taken a stereo sample and made it mono. Because I just, especially because coming from a more studio recording background, I like recording everything in mono. It's just, I like working from mono drum sounds. So we've got one there, and then we've got this snare underneath. And so that is there just again to give a little bit more smack and attack and point. And then we've got a third underneath as well. And so that's actually just a full-on, just straight-up acoustic snare, which I like for the air and the, again, the kind of the body and the woodiness that it adds. So now our snare sound is this, rather than any one of those ones. And then for good measure as well, I've also got a couple snaps on here.
I like that.
And thank you. And so actually, this is something that, coming back to it, that I wish I'd have done before. And this is a fun little thing with layering that you can do as well, is I actually want to pan these snaps out. So now they sit out here. But then when I bring it in with the rest of the drums now, it gives that snare hit a little bit more width. Or if I pull these up. So you want to build, with everything that you're doing in a way, it's all kind of building textures. Is that kind of, would you agree with that, Dennis?
Yes.
And creating layers of interest so that, you know, somebody listening to the song isn't going to hear everything that's in the song within, you know, one or two listens. You want to create intrigue so that people are going to keep coming back. So then, let's look into the next part of it. We'll get into the melody. Or at least the first melody, which is in the synthesizers. So a big thing with creating space, I find, is, especially in melodies, is octaves and, again, more blending tones. So as far as what's going on here, I actually have two different synths that are doing the same line. Got this one. And then, I've also got this one. Down an octave, and with a different tone. Or a different sound entirely. And the reason why I do that is, basically, it creates one unified sound again, but at the same time, it's to a lesser extent than with the, actually to a greater extent than with the drums. It's going to make that sound much more full. That's one by itself. Then I bring the other one in. And then the important thing is that and I'm sure you'll attest to this, Dennis, when the vocal comes in, it immediately becomes the most important element. Unless it's meant to be kind of a more atmospheric thing. But I guess, Dennis, how do you look at the vocal in that way? Is that the most important thing when that starts, or are you typically viewing it as more of a kind of a vessel, or, you know, just part of the vibe, I suppose?
Well, the vocalists usually think it's the most important part.
Yeah.
It depends on the song, right? I mean, you are correct. Sometimes we use vocals as an ambient part to sort of imply melody without focusing too much on the vocal.
Mm-hmm. So I guess in that regard, when you're putting a track together in terms of building the arrangement, I guess typically, for example, once you get to a verse or have established a musical idea throughout the introduction or something like that, you know, how much space would you typically actually leave for the vocal? Are you going to leave it as much room as possible? Are you still going to leave a little bit more texture around it?
Oh, if I'm building a track before a vocal, I throw as much stuff in as I can, or I just do naturally, and then bring the vocal in. And at that point, maybe I might start carving some sounds out or doing some side chaining.
Okay.
To create space for the vocal in the context of a dense layer.
Okay. Yeah, and that's actually an interesting way to think about it, because I definitely kind of like the less is not more, more is more approach until it doesn't work to an extent, where throwing everything in, and it depends too, again, on whether you are wanting to approach a song with the idea of putting vocals on it, or if it's just meant to be an instrumental tune. And so, you know, listening to this, because this was designed as a vocal song, when it gets into the verse, what I do here, an important thing to keep in mind is I wanted to keep my melody going, because let me bring the vocals in now. This was an interesting way that I kind of found to do this, which was you want the vocal to pop, but you want to keep interest in the instrumental. You don't want that to completely die out, because if I take these and I just completely mute them, when the vocals come in, it does kind of feel like it dies out.
The infinite is growing cold. I'm coming back to earth. I can't see anything. I'm falling to the dirt. The sun unfamiliar chases me.
So now we're going to bring the synth back in, and I'll show you what I did.
The infinite is growing cold. I'm coming back to earth. I can't see anything. I'm falling to the dirt.
So Dennis, I don't know if you like to kind of take this approach, but generally for something like this, I'll grab onto one motif and basically try and deconstruct it and reconstruct it in as many ways as possible throughout the song to keep it consistent, but also be something fresh every time it comes up.
Okay, talk to us about how you do that.
Sure. So, basically what I've actually done is it's the exact same motif that's in the intro in the synth, except now I've taken the high octave part and put it on the synth that was originally the low octave. So we're talking about this guy here. So the thing is, if I was to keep it where it was, it would be sitting in the same register as where the vocals are, which would kind of cause them to clash. So instead, by throwing this one up into the air, I've got that same lick going. Except the vocal has its own space in the frequency range, completely kind of not isolated, but it's cleared up a little bit because it's not trying to compete with the synth. And that's something that's kind of important, is that, I guess, with vocals especially, but just in general altogether, you want to make sure you're keeping in mind what needs to be sitting where. So then we'll kind of keep going here. Actually, we'll look into this a little bit as well. Vocal layering. How crazy do you like to go with that typically?
Usually the lead vocals that I work on will be stacked. We look for 3 takes to stack on top of each other, and usually that's, you know, lead, center, and then double left, double right.
Perfect. That's exactly what we've got going here as well. And the reason for that is basically, if you just got one vocal by itself.
The infinite is growing cold. I'm coming back to earth. I can't see anything. I'm falling to.
It's cool, I mean, a lot of people do like that sound, but for this type of music, and just in general, to create some extra density, you can do those doubles, and then.
The infinite is growing cold. I'm coming back to earth. I can't see anything. I'm falling to the.
And so now there's width, there's a fullness within the stereo field that wasn't there before. And then the other thing you can kind of do as well is then start layering in things as well. Like, for example, as a low harmony, I didn't want to sing a low harmony. So instead, I programmed it with the vocoder. I took the original vocal part, just copied it onto an input for a vocoder, and then
worth. I can't see anything. I'm falling to the dirt. The sun unfamiliar chases me.
So from there, that's another interesting way to kind of create intrigue, is by, you know.
Yeah, that's cool.
Thanks. Yeah, the vocoding is an interesting one. So then, the next thing we'll kind of look at again is, you know, in creating more layers, because then you can go from there and then adding, you know, on octave down
chases me. It burns me to the core.
To go underneath these now.
I'll turn my insides out, purge the infection.
And then we get into the big moment, right? I wouldn't really call this a drop, because it's just kind of hitting the chorus. But then you want to think, you've built up your song, right? You go through, you build up. And so I guess the building of tension and the release of tension is a huge, huge part of it. I guess how much of the way that you'd put a track together is actually influenced by that build and release?
Well, kind of depends on if the song has a proper drop or not.
Okay.
So, I mean, if it does, yeah, you want that. If it's, you know, if it's one of the tracks that I'm doing that's more of a sort of down tempo chill thing, those listeners and me as a producer, I'm not really looking to create tension in those environments. But for club tracks, yeah, you definitely want to I spend a lot of time on those moments.
Okay. I mean, so when you're putting those moments together, what is it that you're really, I guess, what is it that you're really trying to do with it? Not in a sense of like, what to you creates that tension and release musically?
Well, I'll use it with sound design and you know, tones. So for example, I'm working with an analog synthesizer, I'll detune the oscillator a little bit. That creates a lot of tension. So maybe the breakdown will stop, and there'll be, imagine there's one note playing, like it's a high synth note. And over a period of time, if you can picture what it sounds like, if you're detuning the oscillator on that, that creates a lot more tension, and you can, you know, that's one sound device that I use for that.
Sure. Let me,
you do it in here.
I'll turn this up. Yeah, that's it. So for example, we start nice and in tune here, and then as that gets detuned, you can start to hear some of the flutter and some of the weirdness. Something like that?
Yeah, for this example, sure, that kind of gets it across. Yeah.
Yeah, cool. And I guess, yeah, so in this case, the way that I'm mostly building this up, for me, I like to do, typically it's more in, for my own approach, it's more in the arrangement than necessarily with sounds, but it depends on what it is. In this case, it's the vocals that build from just going from melody to melody and a low octave to melody and a low octave and harmonies. And then that all encapsulates with coming into chorus.
I'll turn my insides out, purge the infection. Maybe there is strength in resignation. The bottom's all that's gonna save you now.
And so after a chorus like that, I kind of think the most important, arguably the most important bars, like 2 bars in this whole song, I think, are this little re-intro after the chorus. Because it's basically, to me, that's the sort of, almost a reset point of like, okay, this is what the song is about. Let's get into the rest of it. And I guess structurally, that's something to think about as well. Especially, I suppose, again, it would change depending on whether it's going to, like, for a club track, I guess, for example, because those can get really, really long in some examples. So when you have a track that's going to be going longer and is meant to be more instrumental, I guess, how are you keeping the intrigue, you know, as it keeps getting longer? And, you know, are you going to really start drastically changing sounds, changing atmosphere, like just atmospheric things, while keeping the core the same?
Yeah, I mean, usually add melodic elements and harmonic elements and percussive elements. Just keep adding stuff to keep it interesting. Hey, what kind of vocoder do you use? Tyler wants to know.
This is just the Waves Morphoder. Which, yeah, it's just kind of their stock one, nothing too fancy with it. And then as far as actually using that, it's basically, I saw somebody asking about busing earlier. And so within Logic, for example, it's basically on your individual track, you can go down and then just on your sends here, you can dial that up, select one. This is changing. This is the level for it, and now here you have your aux track. And so for using the vocoder, I'm basically, it's not even quite like that. It's just, I've got a vocal track that's going to no output, and then on the Morphoder itself, that track is going into the sidechain, and I've basically printed or drawn in my melody that I wanted to sing, and it's just using the vocal track as a reference for what to do with the words. But the placement and the notes are all actually determined by the vocoder. So then, yeah, looking at all of that stuff, and then getting into the chorus, the reason why, like, what makes it so much bigger there is the fact that now I'm starting to get into things like, you know, bigger chords. I've saved all the chords for the chorus. So now underneath I've got, for example, firstly there's not a chord, but I put in piano there, which is makes it really big. And then I've also changed up the melody a little bit. So that's another thing that you can do is, again, for the chorus, it's the exact same part. It's just I've changed the way that the line ends. And then I've also, a good way you can kind of speed things up or create interest is for the bass now, instead of being 2 taps, it's 3. Which I think, it just speeds it up, gives it more drive, and says like, hey, this is a new part. And then we get these guys in here. And this is also where you want to, obviously, depending on what's happening with the song, is actually this raises a good question as well of, I guess, do you prefer following bass lines or chord progressions? Because I feel like there's a distinct difference between them.
I don't know. I think that I alternate in those approaches.
Okay.
I usually, I wouldn't call them bass lines, just the bass note in a chord progression, just the root motion first. So if usually it's that.
Yeah. Okay.
Unless it's a bass line song, well, that's a bass line.
Yeah.
Following a chord progression like this, you know, if this had come to my mind, this chord progression, it would have come to my mind in the form of the root motions first, and then I'll find the chords after that.
Okay. Yeah, that's an interesting way to think about it, because I find that, yeah, there are some cases where the bass line is so involved that trying to put chords over it is almost like there's no point, because it's just going to step over top of what the bass is doing and then take away from what's supposed to be the most intriguing element of that.
Right.
So that's another important distinction, is as far as, you know, if you're doing bassy stuff, and like, you know, let me just hold on real quick here. You know, going from, oh, let's go down. You know, going from that to something like, right, that kind of thing. It's a completely different feeling, which is probably going to limit to an extent what I can do with my other elements, because that is immediately so much more busy. So instead, I create the intrigue there by, again, going from to, well, everything else explodes around it. And then kind of with the piano here is now I'm emphasizing that bass line, because that's just literally what the piano's doing. And then, for example, you don't necessarily need to think of instruments as instruments. I've got some like choral vocals in here that I'm using specifically to create vibe. It's not even as a, you know, meant to be a vocal part, really. And so, and then as far as the instrumental goes, for this part of the song, that's literally it. I lied about there being chords. Those are in the second chorus. But in this case, again, it's just the thing with this type of what I find that with a lot of this type of arranging and putting music together is that it's, well, it seems complicated. There's actually only like 7 or 8 little parts going on here, and you can condense that down into 3 or 4 if you're saying, like, there's one synth line, it's just 2 octaves doing the same thing. There's one bass, and then, there's some extra harmonies and stuff like that. So I think to see it laid out, I think, like this kind of, I wanted to demystify putting this kind of stuff together, I think was really, really the goal here. And yeah, like typically, I guess, Dennis, with your sessions overall, do they get much more complicated than this? Do they get more complicated than this?
How many tracks you got? Yeah, I cannot stop myself, Andrew, from making my sessions and productions very complex and dense.
Yeah.
So complicated, yeah.
Why do you like that?
I'm not saying I like it. I'm saying I'm just quoted by the need to do it.
Yeah, that's I definitely understand that need. I'm curious as to what makes you feel that need.
No, I just enjoy really large, thick, lush sounds. When I was a kid, I gravitated towards like Hey Jude or A Day in the Life by the Beatles or Bohemian Rhapsody, like the big, massive wall of sound type of production.
Mm-hmm.
I just always have, and so that it's a lot of work to make stuff sound good when they've got so much parts going on. My life would be a lot easier if I just could convince myself that an acoustic guitar and a vocal is enough all the time.
Yeah, I've definitely been there, but yeah, cool. And so yeah, ultimately, just looking at this, it's much arrangements are, you basically want to think of everything as kind of just breaking it all down into smaller chunks, but then realizing that the small chunks are actually still pretty big, I think, is kind of a way of looking at it. And then, like, the one thing that I think that I could have done better with this song is little sound effects and things like that in the background. Because basically for that, the only real atmosphere that I've got going with that is like this guy here. Yeah. The POC, as it's called. Where's my other crap here? This guy here. And that's another thing, right? Is that you can really go crazy with sound effects and things like that. And what have I got here? Like, so just a little cymbal. And for example, actually at the beginning of each big session here as well, I've got another kick that I've added. It doesn't really, that sounds much more like a tom, a big tom than a kick, but
Nice. That's a nice effect there.
yeah. And so what that kind of thing does is then it sets that apart as a new session or a new section within the drums. And so then, is this the same? Let's look at the second verse real quick. Oh yeah, so now I'm setting the second verse apart from the first verse because, well, it's still pretty much all the same. Now I'm adding piano chords. And my biggest piece of advice is for piano players and keyboard players that want to kind of get into doing these types of arrangements is that you want to split your chords. Like here, it's only 2 notes. Doing full chords might not always be the best way to do it, but I always like going the root, basically playing the actual voiced interval an octave above the root. So in this case, we're in D minor. Let me pull up my virtual keyboard so you can see what I'm doing. Where are we at here? Yeah. So see there, I've got that D, instead of doing this, or, right, that sounds kind of like doo-doo. So it's kind of like what I was doing before with keeping my registers separate. So now instead I'm going to move the F, which is the minor third in this case, up an octave. And now it sounds like this. As opposed to... It gets rid of all the mud. And so as far as doing voicings go, or even, for example, if you want to do something like the root and the fifth down the octave, and then you put the third in the middle. That's not the third, but, you know. Which is, again, much more full sounding than... So that's another little consideration for just keeping things nice and open, because I think that's the important thing there. But anyway, as far as the practical stuff, I think that covers it. Let's get into some of the questions. All right, Dennis, this is a very appropriate one. How do you know when your song is done? Do you get lost down the rabbit hole of tinkering? Do you get other people to listen to the song, or is this never a problem for you?
My answer to that is I will tinker something to death. Most producer friends of mine will do the same. Deadlines usually inform when the song is done, when it absolutely has to be uploaded for release or to a client. That is when the song is done. But, you know, Lou Reed felt like songs were never done, that they were just living organisms, that they had a life of their own. You know, whatever a song was in 1972, you know, somebody asked him one time, well, the way you're doing this song is so different than the way it goes. And he said, no, the way it goes is the way it's being performed. You're mistaking a recording that's done. There's a big difference between a recording being done and a song being done. And
yeah.
Case to be made that a song really is never done. It's the recording itself. But so, yeah, to that end, deadlines, very helpful.
Yeah, that's a good point. Let's see. Do you choose a kick knowing you're going to layer it, or try and get one and work with it until you feel it needs layers? Personally, for me, I will go into something for the most part understanding that I'm probably going to want to layer it in a few different ways. Usually because I like creating, again, I like the idea of taking a couple different sounds and then creating a new sound. What are your thoughts on that?
My thoughts on that are that I'm going to share a link.
Okay.
Comments that I just saw last night about kick layering that I found very informative. I was mentioning in the chat earlier that I find YouTube to be a remarkably good resource for learning shit. Here we go.
Yeah.
So that link is that's a guy who broke down and studied the way Disclosure layers their kicks, and I learned a lot about this just last night. I'm constantly learning stuff and online. So that's my answer to that. Yes, I'm usually layer everything for the point that you just made earlier, which is, you know, a kick might have that great knock that you want in the low mids. Another one might have that thump you want. Another one might just have that. It's unusual. It's unlikely that I would ever find one kick that satisfies those three ranges for me: the knock, the sub, the tuning of the sub relative to tuning it for the song, which is an important part of the process, and
yes,
then what's happening on top for the attack or the click.
Yeah, that's another good point actually as well. You want to make sure that your kicks aren't. It's a very subtle thing, but you want to make sure that your kicks aren't kind of sitting in the exact same range as where your basses are, and that's a whole other thing. Let's see. Do you have any rules on changing tempos or not for different parts of the song?
Also a really interesting question, I think, because I would say 99% of electronic music, or dance music anyway, is one tempo throughout.
Mm-hmm.
And I do actually change tempos frequently within a song, which will drive mixers crazy when they get the session and they get the stems. because it doesn't line up on a grid through the entire thing. But yeah, oftentimes I will play with tempo. I'll bring the tempo up a little bit in the chorus, maybe. Yeah, I mean, I'll ride tempos to death, and I don't see that a lot of people do that, and I think it can be employed to great effect.
Yeah, so in that case, are you just doing like a small bump of like 1 or 2 beats per minute? Like
sometimes, and then sometimes I'll ride a tempo. Like if I want to create a moment, picture this. In acoustic music or non-grid based acoustic music, there are a lot of times that in a song,
yeah.
And so I'll ride that stuff. It looks like a roller coaster. I might take a track from 125 and pull that down all the way to 95 over the span of just a bar to give it like a moment to really breathe and then back in.
Okay. Yeah,
I don't know how Logic works for that, but in Ableton you can draw the tempos in on the master track.
Oh yeah, I can do that here.
All right. Okay, great. So, I do that a lot.
Yeah, that type of thing. Cool. And what do you typically use?
I use Ableton Live.
Okay, cool. Let's see. Jen would complete and sound libraries from Logic Pro follow. Yeah, anything like if something is included in as like one of the DAW's actual built-in sound libraries, you can. It's pretty much free reign. It's just that you want to be careful with that in some regards, just because everybody who has that DAW has those sounds. So you're definitely going to want to do some level of manipulation to make them a little bit more unique. Let's see. What do we got here? How do you do your live gigs? If you're, do you just take out the lead vocal and play the rest of the tracks? I guess in your case, if you're working with singers and whatnot, like if you're doing a show, what does your kind of show look like from what you're performing?
Well, I'll answer that in general terms of the way electronic music performance shows usually go. If there's a singer involved, they'll put what's called a TV track vocal. A TV track vocal is just the vocal much lower in the mix for a little bit of support, and then the vocals will typically sing on top of that, and then the harmonies will be kind of at full volume in the recording. And there's no one answer to how the music gets out of the stereo output of the mixing board. Some guys have 16 things going on, and some guys have 2 things going on.
Right. Cool. So this one's from David. For a singer-songwriter in over their head trying to self-produce music, how'd you go about finding mixers to pitch an electronic song to? Or is it good? Well, the thing is, to cover that, basically, you're going to want to work with the producer, because the mixer can't really do anything with the song until a song exists. Specifically, like the mixer is basically the person who's taking the final product, essentially, of the produced track and then giving it its sort of doing the final little balancing and whatnot. In a case like this, so are you typically sending your tracks out to be mixed? You're not doing that yourself for the most part?
Me personally?
Yes.
I prefer to have somebody do what I call a stem mix master. So I'll get the mix where I really want it to be in the production, where I really want it to be. But I love mixing, but fiddling around for a day and a half to really dial in a mix is not the best use of my time. It's better for me to get on to the next production. So I prefer to pass the last finished thing over to someone else.
Okay. Yeah, so to answer your question, David, you're going to work with the producer until the song is done, and then from there you're going to look at mixing. In most cases, producers can mix, and will be able to. It's just a matter of whether or not they'll want to do that project or anything like that. But yeah, you want to work with the producer. As far as actually putting your songs together, building your songs, writing songs, that's the producer. That's not a mixer.
Nikki, you're right. It is good to have fresh ears, because what I find in my mixes, I have a great capacity for thinking it sounds the way that it is in my brain, but that's not really what's happening. It's like if someone has a pet in their home, and after a period of time, you don't realize that your house smells like dog because you're so used to it. But leave and you come back, you're like, damn, it smells like dog in here. I gotta air this stuff out. Senses do that. They kind of become desensitized to something. So yes, Nikki, to your point, it's very valuable for me to have fresh ears on something because I'm usually not right about what I think is happening in my track.
Yeah, it's mixing. The kind of the difference between producing and mixing is a very fine line because I'm kind of in an opposite boat. Whereas if I've produced something, I don't want somebody else touching the mix. I'll let the mastering engineer take care of like any little things that I might have messed up in that regard. But like I know very much what I want things to sound like exactly. Yeah. So I personally don't like other people mixing my stuff. But it's different for everybody because like what we're listening to here is like
those little decisions can be so important to what a track does and how it behaves and the impact. I mean, the decision, and it's a subjective decision, where the hi-hat in a dance track, for example, the volume of the hi-hat is going to make a huge impact on the effect that it has on a dance floor. And so to your point, I would not pass that over to a mixer to decide that kind of stuff. I just need somebody. I don't have 2 hours to play around with the low end. My low end is always a mess, and I hand that over to a mastering guy or an engineer to dial in the low end, because also that has a huge effect on what's going to happen with the track and the impact that it's going to have. And that's high science, man. That's for somebody else.
Yeah. And that's one of the things too, is like if you're coming at it from more of just like I'm making the song and making it just kind of what I want, that's, you're going to want to maybe find a mixer. But if you know exactly what you want things to sound like and you kind of feel confident with dealing with them, then, go for it. And like I think everybody should take the time to kind of at least have an idea of what the mixing process is like. But for the most part, for actually the arranging and stuff, like the idea, what we're covering here is more against the ideas of actually putting a song together from a musical standpoint and from an arranging standpoint. And the last question I've got from Shelton here, for this song in particular, was there an underlying structure entirely sketched before you began to No. My style is very bad in that regard, where I just build the song as I go. And that's typically how I always do it, and for better or for worse. And do you usually have an entire thing mapped out, or do you just kind of go for it, Dennis?
Oh, I'd never had it mapped out. No, I don't have a template. I don't have a plan. I'm the worst organizational skill set for sounds and samples. I'm a disaster. I'm basically starting every track purely from scratch.
Yeah,
it's a waste of time.
Well, that's very reassuring because same here, honestly, because it's like I like letting each song just kind of breathe and evolve as its own thing rather than trying to get rigid about it. And it also allows me to kind of inform and decide what I want to do with the production as I'm making the song, because that's a very important part about it for me. But anyway, I think that'll just about do it for today. Again, this webinar will be available on nwcwebinars.com later in the week. There's also going to be an email going out with some additional resources and everything within the next couple hours. So again, thanks everybody for sticking around and for all your awesome questions. And Dennis, thank you so much for joining me.
Well, thanks for having me. Thanks for your time, everybody, and for joining us. I hope that all of you got something out of this. I know that I did, so thank you very much for including me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for joining me. And again, everybody, make sure to go to nwcwebinars.com, check out some other ones that we've got in the past, and I'll make sure that this YouTube link that you threw in here gets out to everybody as well.
Nice one. Yeah. Okay. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Take care and have a great rest of your week, and happy Thanksgiving for the American viewers.
Thank you very much. Bye.
All right. See you, everybody.